An elderly wealthy woman asked a homeless young girl to stay with her during her final days. What she revealed right before dying changed the woman's future forever. The cold city wind blew mercilessly, but Olivia barely felt it anymore. She had learned to live with it, just like she had learned to live with hunger and the disdainful stares that followed her everywhere. She walked with her head down, her worn-out clothes doing little to protect her from the winter, but the cold was the least of her worries. Each step was a small battle to keep going, despite the feeling deep inside her that there was no real reason to continue. She had been living on the streets for years since the fire. The flames had devoured everything, her home, her family, her future. Sometimes when she closed her eyes, she could still see the fire consuming her house, the black smoke filling the sky as her mother and sister's screams faded into the darkness. It had been a nightmarish night, and although the flames had died down, the fire inside Olivia continued to burn. There was no escape from that pain, and over time, she had come to accept that her life would forever be a reflection of what she had lost, consumed by the fire. That morning had been especially hard. The shelter she sometimes slept in was closed for inspection, and the corner she found to spend the night barely shielded her from the cold. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in over a day. She had tried her luck at the bakery nearby, hoping the owner, who occasionally gave her some stale bread, would have something for her. But this morning there was no such luck. The owner didn't even acknowledge her presence. As usual, she was invisible to the world around her. As she walked through the crowded streets, her eyes met those of the passers-by who hurriedly avoided her gaze. In the distance, she saw mothers rushing, holding their children's hands, young people leaving stores with bags full of things she would never have, and executives bustling in and out of offices, too busy to notice someone like her. Olivia wondered, not for the first time, how her life had reached this point, how she had gone from being a regular girl to a stranger in her own city. Amid the crowd, her mind drifted back to the days before the fire. She remembered the laughter in the kitchen, the Sunday afternoons when her mother would cook for everyone. It was a simple life, but it was hers. Now all of that felt like a distant dream, a life that belonged to someone else. Olivia continued walking, searching for a place to sit for a moment. Her feet carried her to a small park in a quiet corner of the city. She sat on a bench, her hands trembling as she rubbed them together, trying to warm up. She closed her eyes and let the city's hum surround her. For a moment, she tried to imagine herself somewhere else, in a different life. She couldn't afford to cry. She had stopped crying long ago, not because the pain had lessened, but because she knew tears wouldn't change anything. She had to be strong. She had to survive, even if she didn't always know why. In the distance, a sleek car pulled up in front of a grand mansion. Olivia glanced up, distracted by the grandeur of the house, an imposing building that dominated the landscape of the street. The windows gleamed with light, and from where she sat she could see heavy curtains and chandeliers hanging inside. It was a life of luxury and comfort, so far removed from her own that it felt like another world. But something made her keep looking. In one of the windows, she saw the silhouette of an elderly woman watching her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in the old woman's gaze, Olivia saw something she didn't expect: deep sadness, a void that words couldn't explain. That look was the last thing Olivia expected to find in such a place. For a second, she wondered what could be behind those sorrowful eyes. Could that woman, surrounded by luxury, feel the same loneliness as her? But she quickly brushed the thought aside. That old woman, like everyone else, would surely move on with her life, not giving someone like her a second thought. The day went on. Olivia knew she had to move before the cold overwhelmed her completely. She stood up from the bench and started walking again, unaware that the old woman's eyes were still fixed on her from afar. To Olivia, the day would be like any other, a struggle to survive. But what she didn't know was that that look, that brief crossing of paths, would change her life forever. On the other side of the city, beyond the lights and noise, stood the imposing mansion of Margaret McAllister. Built of stone and surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, it was a silent testament to the wealth and power that had accompanied Margaret throughout her life. However, to her, those luxuries were nothing more than a reminder of what she had lost. The fortune she had amassed with her late husband, once her pride, no longer brought her any comfort. All she had left was the pain of loneliness and an illness that was slowly weakening her. At 78, Margaret spent most of her days in the same room, a large space with grand windows through which she could observe the world outside, a world she no longer felt a part of. She had isolated herself. She had stopped receiving visitors years ago, and the only interruptions to the silence of her days were the occasional visits from Alice, her nurse, and Victor, her lawyer. Alice had become a constant presence in Margaret's life. At first, their relationship had been strictly professional, but over the years, as Margaret's frailty increased, Alice had become almost indispensable. She made sure Margaret took her medication, helped her dress, and arranged her meals. Although Alice tried to maintain an emotional distance, Margaret knew the woman cared for her in a way that went beyond the professional. But that care also came with something else, a growing possessiveness that Margaret was beginning to notice. Victor, on the other hand, was a more distant figure. Impeccably dressed and always formal, Victor had handled Margaret's legal and financial affairs since her husband's death. Over the years, he had gained the old woman's trust, skillfully managing her investments and ensuring her fortune continued to grow. However, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Victor had his own interests. He often visited to discuss business matters that, in her current state, no longer interested her. But Margaret let him continue. She knew her time was running out, and she didn't want to burden herself with more worries. That morning, as Margaret sat in her chair, wrapped in a fine wool blanket, she thought of the past. Her gaze wandered through the landscapes of her memory, revisiting the happy days with her husband, and, above all, the memories of her son, Charles. Once life had been perfect. Charles had been her pride and joy, her only child, the hope of carrying on the family legacy. But that all changed the day he died. After that, nothing made sense anymore. The pain of losing Charles was not just the pain of a mother losing her son. It was something deeper, something Margaret had never shared with anyone, not even with Alice or Victor. There was something that gnawed at her, a secret she had kept for years. She knew that Charles's death had not been a simple accident, but she had never had the courage to face the truth. And now, as her life neared its end, that weight was becoming unbearable. As Margaret mused, she noticed Alice entering the room with a tray of breakfast. The nurse placed the tray on the table next to Margaret's chair and approached her with a warm yet forced smile. "Good morning, Mrs. McAllister. How are you feeling today?" Alice asked in a soft voice. Margaret barely looked at her. Her mind was still lost in the past, in the memories of Charles. Alice noticed the distance in the old woman's eyes but said nothing. She was used to Margaret's silences, to her unshakable melancholy. Sometimes Alice wondered what tormented the old woman beyond her physical pain. She knew Charles's death had been the final blow, but she also sensed there was something more, something Margaret had never shared with anyone. "Would you like me to help you up so you can have breakfast?" Alice insisted. Margaret slowly shook her head. She wasn't hungry, just as she rarely ever was. But that didn't matter. What truly troubled her was the deep loneliness she felt, even surrounded by people. Alice, despite being her nurse, could never fill the void left by Charles's death. Later, as Alice left the room, Victor entered with a folder under his arm. His expression was serious, as always, and he approached Margaret's chair with firm steps. "Margaret, I need you to sign some papers," he said without preamble. Margaret looked at him wearily. Most of the time she didn't understand what Victor was presenting to her, and at this point in her life she barely cared. But something about Victor's demeanor unsettled her. There was a coldness in his gestures, a distance that made her feel like nothing more than a burden in his life. Still, she took the pen and signed where Victor indicated, without asking any questions. Victor gave her a brief, calculated smile before tucking the documents back into his folder. "Don't worry, Margaret. I'll take care of everything." With those words, he left the room, leaving her alone once again. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion take over. Although she couldn't pinpoint it clearly, there was something in her life that troubled her. Something didn't quite fit, and she had been ignoring it for too long. But she knew her time was running out, and before she died, she had to face the truth she had hidden for so many years. That same afternoon, from the window of her room, Margaret watched the outside world. It was then that she saw a thin, disheveled figure walking along the sidewalk in front of her mansion. It was a young girl dressed in rags, her face marked by the harshness of life. Her tired, sad expression resonated deeply within Margaret. The old woman didn't know why, but something about that girl struck her in an unexpected way. In that moment, she felt a connection with her, a connection she couldn't explain. Who was this girl? Why did she remind Margaret so much of herself in her youth, when she had struggled alongside her husband? Margaret didn't know, but suddenly she had a clear and deep feeling. She needed this girl by her side. Although she didn't know it yet, that impulsive decision would change both her life and the girl's forever. The afternoon sun was setting as Olivia walked through the streets, as she did every day, lost among the passers-by who never noticed her. Sometimes she wondered if she even existed to the rest of the world. Her steps once again brought her in front of the imposing mansion she had seen a few days ago. She couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and resignation as she gazed at the house that seemed to belong to another world, one in which she would never fit. As she slowly made her way toward the next corner, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The rear door opened smoothly, and from inside, a tall, well-dressed man stepped out. Olivia paused for a moment, watching cautiously. The man, who looked to be no older than 40, walked straight toward her with a calm but firm expression. "Olivia, right?" the man asked, looking her directly in the eyes. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't common for someone to call her by her name. In fact, most people didn't bother talking to her at all. Always wary, Olivia took a step back, feeling the natural distrust she had developed over the years on the streets wrap around her like a second skin. "Who are you?" she responded, her voice tense and her gaze alert. The man remained calm. His posture and voice conveyed authority but not aggression. "My name is Victor, and I am Mrs. Margaret McAllister's lawyer. She wishes to see you." Olivia looked at him incredulously. Who was Margaret McAllister? And more importantly, why would someone like her want to see a homeless girl like Olivia, just another among the thousands wandering the streets? Nothing about this offer seemed real. "I don't understand," Olivia replied, glancing toward the car that remained parked beside them. "What does she want from me?" Victor sighed slightly, as if used to such questions. His face, however, showed no hint of emotion. "Mrs. McAllister saw you a few days ago from her window. She wants to talk to you and has requested that you come with me. You have nothing to worry about." Victor paused before adding, "She's offering you something that could change your life." The words "change your life" echoed in Olivia's mind like a distant whisper. She had been surviving for so long, so accustomed to disdain and indifference, that the idea of someone wanting to help her seemed absurd. An old millionaire woman wanted to see her? Why? Olivia hesitated. Logic told her to reject the offer. It was too strange, too unreal. But something inside her, a deep curiosity, and perhaps a desperate desire to find a way out of her misery, made her waver. For a moment she remembered the sad, empty look in the old woman's eyes through the window, a look that in some way had resonated with her own. "What exactly does she want from me?" Olivia finally asked, crossing her arms defensively. Victor watched her with an inscrutable expression. "Just your company. There's no trick, no ulterior motive. She's sick and alone, and she's offering you something in return for spending time with her, a considerable sum of money if you accept." Victor looked her straight in the eyes, as if trying to convey that he was telling the truth. "You have nothing to lose, Olivia." Olivia remained silent for a few moments, weighing the proposal. She knew that life had taught her to distrust everything and everyone, but she also knew that if she continued living this way, she probably wouldn't survive much longer. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance she needed to change her fate. Finally, Olivia made a decision. With her heart pounding, she looked at Victor and nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll accept." Victor didn't smile, but he nodded in satisfaction. He opened the car's rear door, and Olivia, still filled with uncertainty, climbed into the vehicle. As she settled into the leather seat, her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Was she making a mistake? Was she taking too big of a risk? The car pulled away in silence, taking her toward a future she couldn't foresee. As they drove, Olivia watched the familiar streets of the city slowly fade behind them. The narrow, dark avenues she was used to walking down transformed into wide, tree-lined boulevards filled with mansions. It was a completely different world from hers. Finally, they arrived at the McAllister mansion. From inside the car, Olivia watched as the massive iron gates slowly opened to let the vehicle through. As they crossed the entrance, everything around her seemed straight out of a movie. The perfectly manicured garden, the marble fountain in the center, and the trees lining the path to the main door. Nothing in that place resembled the life Olivia had known. The car came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, and before she could fully process what was happening, Victor had already opened the door for her to step out. Olivia felt small, insignificant, standing before the majesty of the house. "Follow me," Victor instructed, and with her heart racing, Olivia followed him toward the front door of the mansion. Upon crossing the threshold, the air inside the house felt warmer, almost stifling. The luxury surrounding her was overwhelming. Thick carpets muffling her steps, gold-framed paintings on the walls, and chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. For someone who had spent years sleeping on the streets, it all felt unreal. "Mrs. McAllister is expecting you in the drawing room," Victor said, pointing the way. Olivia nodded, though she didn't dare speak. As she walked toward the room Victor had indicated, her mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was about to face. When she entered the room, the first thing she saw was Margaret McAllister, seated in a chair by an enormous window. The light of the setting sun bathed the room, giving the old woman an almost ethereal appearance. Margaret slowly turned her head toward Olivia, her blue eyes meeting Olivia's, and a faint smile appeared on her face. "You've come," Margaret said in a soft but firm voice. Still surprised, Olivia nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, a mix of confusion and respect in her tone. Margaret observed her for a few seconds before speaking again. "You must be wondering why I called for you," the elderly woman said, her gaze penetrating yet warm. "The answer is simple. I'm dying, and before I go I need company, not the company of Alice or Victor who are merely doing their duties. I want to be with someone who understands what pain and loneliness are like, someone like you." Margaret's words resonated deeply in Olivia's heart. She had expected some sort of offer based on money, some kind of transaction, but what she found was something far more profound. In Margaret's eyes, she saw a sadness that wasn't so different from her own. "You're asking me to live here?" Olivia asked, still incredulous. "Just for a time," Margaret responded, "until I'm gone. In return, I'll leave you a sum that will change your life. But beyond the money, I want us both to find some peace in these last days." Margaret paused, then added in a softer tone, "You and I are not as different as you think." Olivia didn't know how to respond. At that moment, the weight of the decision she was about to make felt overwhelming. Before her, a wealthy old woman was offering her something more than money. She was offering her a glimpse of humanity, something Olivia hadn't felt in a long time. Finally, after a long silence, Olivia took a deep breath and nodded. "I accept," she said, unsure of what that decision would truly entail. Thus began a new chapter in her life, one filled with promises, mysteries, and hidden dangers she couldn't yet imagine. Olivia stood before Margaret, unsure of what to say. The proposal she had just received seemed unreal, like a dream, but at the same time, a small part of her wanted to believe that this could be her chance to escape the misery she had lived in for years. Margaret, with her penetrating gaze and calm tone, watched her with a patience that contrasted with the turmoil Olivia felt inside. "Sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "I don't like talking to someone standing as if they're my servant. That's not what I want from you." Olivia, still in a daze, slowly obeyed. The chair was far more comfortable than she expected, and as she sank into it, she realized she had forgotten what it felt like to sit on something so soft. The contrast between her life on the streets and the luxury of the mansion was overwhelming. Everything in Margaret's home made her feel out of place. "There's no need to be afraid," Margaret continued, her voice gentle yet authoritative. "I know you must be suspicious. It's only natural. If I were in your position, I would probably feel the same way. But I want you to understand something, Olivia. This is no trick or game. What I'm offering you is real. I simply want you to spend my final days with me, nothing more." Olivia swallowed hard, her thoughts still trying to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. Margaret's offer didn't make sense to her. Why would a woman like Margaret, with all the money in the world, want the company of someone like her, a woman who had nothing to offer? It was a gesture that defied all logic. "Why me?" Olivia finally asked, her voice trembling. "Why not ask someone you trust? You have Alice, you have your lawyer, you have, I don't know, so many people who would surely be happy to help." Margaret let out a small laugh, but it wasn't a mocking laugh. It was more a mix of resignation and weariness. "Alice and Victor, they're only here because I pay them. They're good at what they do, don't get me wrong, but they don't offer me what I need. Victor handles my legal affairs, and Alice takes care of my health. But I don't want to die surrounded by people who see me as a walking bank account or a body they need to keep functioning a little longer. I want to be with someone who has no hidden agenda, someone who understands what pain and loss are." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Someone like you, Olivia." The silence that followed her words was thick and heavy. Olivia felt something stir inside her. The way Margaret spoke about pain and loneliness struck a chord deep within her. Though she didn't know why, Olivia could see in Margaret's eyes a sadness that wasn't very different from her own. It was an inexplicable, yet real, connection. "I know it's not easy for you to trust anyone," Margaret continued, "but what I'm offering isn't just money, though I know you need it. I'm offering you something more, the chance to be here, safe, without having to worry about where you'll sleep tomorrow or whether you'll have food. And when I'm gone, you'll have enough to start fresh, to leave behind the life you've had until now." Olivia felt a lump in her throat. Margaret's words hit her hard, not only because of the promise of a better future, but because they reminded her of how fragile and precarious her existence had become. For so long she had dreamed of a second chance, but she had always believed that dream was unattainable. Now, suddenly, a real possibility to change her destiny was being presented to her, but the distrust she had learned to develop after so many years on the streets kept her on guard. "This sounds too good to be true," Olivia admitted, looking Margaret in the eyes. "What is it that you really want from me, Margaret?" Margaret gave her a sad smile. "I want something very simple, your company. I don't want to die alone, Olivia. I don't want to spend my last days surrounded by people who only see me as a sick old woman. I want to be with someone who sees me as a human being, not as a burden. I want someone to talk to, someone who will listen, someone who will be there when I need them, and I believe you can be that person." Olivia remained silent, absorbing what Margaret had just said. There was something about the way Margaret spoke that touched her heart. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, someone saw her, really saw her, not as a homeless woman, not as someone who had failed in life, but as someone worth sharing something as profound as the final days of a life. After a few minutes of reflection, Olivia took a deep breath. She knew that accepting meant leaving behind the life she knew, even if it was a miserable one, and plunging into something completely unknown. But she also knew this might be her only chance to escape the cycle of poverty and suffering she had been trapped in for so long. "All right," she finally said, her voice firm yet still filled with uncertainty. "I accept." Margaret nodded with an expression that mixed gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she said simply. "You won't regret it, I promise." At that moment, Alice entered the room carrying a tray with tea and some biscuits. Her eyes quickly darted toward Olivia, and though she said nothing, Olivia noticed a brief flicker of distrust in her gaze. It was clear Alice wasn't used to seeing strangers in the house, especially someone like Olivia. "Mrs. McAllister," Alice said in her professional tone, "do you need anything else?" "No, thank you, Alice, just the tea." Margaret shifted her attention away from Alice and back to Olivia. "Take your time to get accustomed, Olivia. This house is large and can be intimidating, but it's yours while you're here. Alice and Victor will help you settle in." Alice glanced at Margaret for a moment before leaving the room without saying another word. Olivia watched her go, sensing the tension in the air. She could tell her presence wasn't welcomed by everyone in the house, and that only heightened her unease. "Don't worry about Alice," Margaret said, as if she had read Olivia's thoughts. "She just needs time to adjust. She can be a bit territorial, but she's a good person. And as for Victor," Margaret paused, "well, he's a businessman. Don't expect warmth from him." Olivia nodded, but she knew Margaret's words didn't offer much reassurance. Despite the old woman's kindness, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on in this house, something she couldn't yet see but which would slowly begin to reveal its true colors. Margaret gave her one last smile before closing her eyes, tired from the effort of the conversation. Olivia remained seated in silence, watching the old woman, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Life was offering her something unexpected, but with it came new challenges, and Olivia knew she would have to be ready to face them. The first rays of morning light filtered through the mansion's massive windows, illuminating the room where Olivia had spent her first night in years, under a roof that wasn't a shelter or an improvised corner on the street. The room was majestic, with deep red velvet curtains, antique furniture, and a bed so large that Olivia felt small and uncomfortable in it. The silk sheets felt foreign, and the silence was overwhelming. There were no street noises, no nighttime sounds of the city to keep her on edge. She slowly sat up in bed, her bare feet touching the cold marble floor. She looked around, unable to fully process how she had come to be in this place. Just a day before, she had been sleeping outdoors, her head filled with worries about where she would get her next meal. Now she was in a mansion. The change was so abrupt that it made her feel out of place. Olivia tried to hold on to the thought that she was safe, that she no longer had to worry about survival, at least for a while. But the reality of her situation was still confusing. Who was Margaret, really? Why had she chosen her? And most importantly, what would be expected of her in the days to come? The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled her out of her thoughts. The door opened softly and Alice appeared in the doorway, her expression as neutral as it had been the night before. Her eyes quickly scanned the room, briefly resting on Olivia but without revealing any emotion. "Good morning, Olivia," Alice said in her professional voice. "Mrs. McAllister has asked me to take you to breakfast. Would you like me to show you the dining room?" Olivia nodded silently, rising clumsily from the bed. Alice observed her with a faint, almost imperceptible look of disapproval, as if she couldn't help but see Olivia as an intruder. However, she maintained her professional demeanor as she led Olivia down the mansion's wide corridors. The walls were adorned with paintings and family portraits that told a story of power and wealth, a story in which Olivia couldn't help but feel like a discordant piece. "Did you sleep well?" Alice asked, breaking the silence as they walked. "Yes, I suppose," Olivia replied, her voice timid, feeling awkward under the nurse's gaze. "It's a big house, but you'll get used to it. We all do in the end," Alice added, though Olivia noticed a subtle tone of warning in her words. They arrived at the dining room, a vast space with a long, dark wooden table that seemed made to host dozens of people, though only a small corner of the table was set for breakfast for two. Olivia sat by a window overlooking the garden, and once again the contrast with her former life hit her hard. Here she was, surrounded by luxury, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. Margaret arrived shortly after, accompanied by Victor. The old woman looked more fragile in the daylight, her movements slow, and her face, though serene, showed signs of fatigue. However, her eyes remained sharp, observing Olivia with a mix of curiosity and compassion. "Good morning, Olivia," Margaret said with a faint smile. "I hope you feel a bit more comfortable today." "Good morning, thank you," Olivia responded, still feeling out of place. Margaret slowly took her seat while Victor stood by her side, always impeccable, always distant. Olivia couldn't help but feel a slight discomfort in his presence. Although his demeanor was professional, there was something about his gaze that unsettled her, as if he were calculating her every move. "Victor, we don't need you to stay," Margaret said, giving him a quick look. Victor nodded politely and left the room without a word. The silence following his departure was palpable, as if the tension he brought with him had momentarily dissipated. "I want you to feel at home, Olivia," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "I know this place can be overwhelming, but you don't need to worry about anything. All I need from you is your company." Olivia nodded, still feeling out of place. Margaret gave her a warm smile, as if she understood the internal conflict the young woman was experiencing. "I know this change is huge for you, but I want you to know that you can trust me," Margaret added, her voice gentle but firm. "You'll be safe here." The word safe echoed in Olivia's mind. It was something she hadn't felt in a long time, but despite Margaret's kind words, Olivia couldn't shake her unease. She was surrounded by luxury, but she still didn't understand her place in this world. The breakfast passed in awkward silence. Margaret tried to engage Olivia in conversation, asking her about her life, but Olivia's answers were brief and evasive. She wasn't used to talking about herself, much less with someone who seemed to come from another universe. After breakfast, Margaret asked Alice to give Olivia a tour of the mansion so she could familiarize herself with the place. As they walked through the hallways adorned with art and antiques, Alice kept an emotional distance, pointing out the various rooms and areas of the house without much conversation. "This is the East Wing," Alice said as they walked through a section of the mansion where the windows overlooked the back garden. "Here is the library, a sitting room, and a few rooms that are no longer used." Alice paused for a moment before continuing, "In reality, much of the house remains empty most of the time." Olivia nodded silently, her thoughts still scattered. The mansion was vast, filled with a history she didn't know, and it seemed too far removed from her own life. "What do you think of Mrs. McAllister?" Alice suddenly asked without looking at her. The question caught Olivia off guard. She didn't know how to answer. She was still trying to understand why Margaret had brought her into her life, but there was something in Alice's question that suggested there was more to her relationship with the elderly woman. "She seems like a good person," Olivia said, choosing her words carefully. Alice nodded slowly, saying nothing more. However, her silence seemed to speak volumes. Olivia could feel that Alice was protecting something, perhaps a deeper relationship with Margaret than she was willing to admit. And although Alice was polite and professional, there was an underlying tension in all of their interactions that made Olivia feel watched. The rest of the day passed in a strange calm. Olivia spent most of her time exploring the mansion in silence, feeling more like a spectator than someone who belonged there. The house, with its opulence and history, made her feel small and insignificant, as if at any moment she might wake up and realize it had all been a dream. That night, as she prepared to sleep, she couldn't help but think about what Margaret had said. Could she really trust her? Why would someone like Margaret want to be around a stranger like her, a homeless woman with no clear past or future? Despite everything, there was something in Margaret's eyes that told her the old woman also carried her own pain, and in some way they were connected by that shared suffering. Olivia slipped under the sheets, but sleep was slow to come. She still didn't understand her place in this world, nor what to expect from the days ahead. She knew something else was happening in that mansion, something she couldn't yet see clearly, and as her thoughts faded into the darkness, she knew that while she was safe for now, not everything was as it seemed. The sun was just beginning to set when Olivia entered the drawing room, where Margaret waited in her favorite chair, the same one from which she had watched the world for years. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, reflecting a calmness Olivia didn't feel. It had been a few days since she moved into the mansion, and although the surroundings were peaceful, the young woman couldn't shake the feeling that she was constantly being watched. Alice, with her calculated distance, and Victor, always observing with his cold courtesy, added to that atmosphere of tension. "Come, Olivia," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. "Sit with me. Today I want to talk to you about something important." Olivia obeyed, sitting in a chair across from Margaret. She had spent the last few hours exploring the house, trying to familiarize herself with the endless hallways and rooms filled with memories of a bygone era. But everything she found only made her feel more disconnected from that world of wealth and luxury. She felt like a stranger within those walls. Margaret settled into her chair as if preparing for a crucial moment. Her face, despite the wrinkles etched by time, showed a mixture of strength and vulnerability. When she began to speak, Her voice was tinged with a melancholy that made Olivia tense. "I've told you a little about my life before," Margaret began, gazing out the window toward the horizon. "But there's a part I've avoided, for reasons you'll soon understand." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "I want to tell you about Charles, my son." Olivia had heard the name Charles mentioned several times since she arrived. She knew his death had deeply affected Margaret, but until now, the elderly woman hadn't gone into detail. Olivia nodded, knowing that what Margaret was about to share would be difficult for both of them. "Charles was everything to me," Margaret continued, her trembling hands resting on her lap. "My husband and I raised him with so much love, hoping he would carry on the legacy we had built. He was a brilliant young man, full of life, but he also carried a burden we perhaps failed to notice in time." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if the memories were too heavy to bear. Olivia watched her in silence, feeling the weight of the elderly woman's words resonate in her own heart. She couldn't help but empathize with Margaret's pain, a pain she knew all too well. Though Olivia had lost her family under different circumstances, the loss was still an open wound. "The day Charles died, something inside me broke," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I lost him in an accident that, to this day, I still don't fully understand. The circumstances, they always seemed unclear to me. But beyond the accident, it's what happened before that haunts me." Olivia frowned, intrigued. There was something in Margaret's voice that suggested there was more behind Charles's death, something that had not come to light. "Shortly before his death, Charles and I grew apart," Margaret continued. "He stopped talking to me, stopped coming to the house as often. I didn't know what was going on with him, but now I realize he was struggling with something much bigger than I could see. The most painful part is that I never had the chance to find out what it was." Margaret's words were heavy with a deep sense of guilt. Olivia, who had learned to read pain in other people's eyes, could see that Margaret blamed herself not only for her son's death, but for not being there when he needed her the most. "Do you think something else drove him away?" Olivia asked, choosing her words carefully. Margaret looked at her, her eyes filled with an endless sadness. "I don't know, that's what's tormented me all these years. Victor, our lawyer, always told me it was just an accident, that Charles was under a lot of stress from work, from the responsibilities placed on him. But I can't shake the feeling that there was something more, something I didn't see or didn't want to see." The room filled with silence, and Olivia felt the weight of Margaret's words envelop her. She understood the feeling of carrying guilt for events beyond her control. She had spent years reliving the night of the fire that killed her family, wondering if there was something she could have done to change the outcome. "You never looked into it more?" Olivia asked, her curiosity growing. Margaret shook her head slowly. "I didn't have the strength to. After Charles's death, I sank into a darkness that I barely managed to pull myself out of. I let Victor handle everything, and since then, I've lived with that doubt, that pain that never goes away." Victor's name echoed in Olivia's mind. Though she hadn't had many interactions with him, something about his distant and controlling demeanor had always unsettled her. But it wasn't just that. The way Margaret spoke about her relationship with Charles, the vague details surrounding his death. It all seemed too convenient, too clean. Olivia began to suspect that there was more to the story than Margaret knew or was willing to accept. "Sometimes pain becomes a barrier," Olivia said, more to herself than to Margaret. "It blinds you and keeps you from seeing what's right in front of you." Margaret nodded, as if she perfectly understood what Olivia meant. "You're right," she replied. "It blinded me for far too long." Both women shared a moment of silence, each dealing with their own pain. Margaret, burdened by the loss of her son, and Olivia, carrying the wounds of her past, felt an invisible bond connecting them. Though they came from completely different worlds, the pain and loneliness they both bore made them more alike than anyone could have imagined. "I want you to know something, Olivia," Margaret said after a while. "Even though this arrangement began as a way for me not to be alone in my final days, I feel like I brought you here for a deeper reason. I think we can both help each other find some peace, something we might not have found on our own." Olivia didn't know how to respond. Margaret's words were sincere, but the confusion in her mind remained. What was it that had truly brought them together? Was it just the pain? Or was there something more that she had yet to discover? "You don't have to answer now," Margaret said gently, as if she understood Olivia's thoughts. "I just wanted you to know." Olivia nodded, but her mind continued to whirl. Despite the connection she felt with Margaret, she couldn't ignore the growing doubts forming within her. The story of Charles, Victor's constant presence, the distant relationship with Alice, everything seemed shrouded in a mystery that Olivia couldn't ignore. And though she didn't yet have all the pieces of the puzzle, she knew she had to keep investigating for both Margaret and herself. That night, as she lay in bed in the mansion, her thoughts continued to torment her. She felt like she was on the verge of discovering something important, but the path to the truth was uncertain and filled with dangers she couldn't yet foresee. One thing was clear: Margaret's pain wasn't so different from her own. Both had been shattered by tragedies that had changed them forever. And as she reflected on everything Margaret had shared with her, Olivia decided that she wasn't just going to be there to accompany the elderly woman in her final days, but also to uncover the truth that they both deserved. The atmosphere in the McAllister mansion was beginning to change. Days had passed since the conversation between Margaret and Olivia, and though their relationship seemed to be strengthening, something dark was brewing in the corners of the house. Alice and Victor, while still performing their professional roles with apparent normalcy, began to exhibit behaviors that made Olivia uncomfortable. The tension between them was palpable, and though no one said it aloud, it was clear they didn't approve of Margaret and Olivia's growing closeness. That morning, as Olivia walked through the mansion's hallways, she felt eyes following her every step. It wasn't just the discomfort of being in a place where she didn't belong, but the feeling that she was under constant observation. As she neared the dining room for breakfast, she passed by a slightly ajar door and overheard voices speaking in low tones. She stopped, recognizing Alice's voice. "This can't go on, Victor," Alice said, her irritation barely contained in her voice. "Mrs. Margaret is making decisions without consulting us, and it's all because of that girl." Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Alice didn't like her, but she hadn't expected to hear something so direct. She moved a little closer to the door, trying not to make any noise. "The situation is delicate," Victor replied in his usual controlled tone. "Margaret is not at her best, and that young woman has found a way to gain her trust. But don't worry, Alice. Everything is under control. Margaret is still my client, and I won't let anything jeopardize what we've built over the years." Olivia's heart began to race. Though she didn't fully understand Victor's words, there was something in his tone that unsettled her. She felt that in some way she was being seen as a threat, though she didn't know exactly why. "Under control?" Alice retorted with a slight scoff. "Margaret is considering changing her will, Victor. Everything could change if she decides to include that girl. Do you realize what that means for us?" Olivia felt as if the ground beneath her shifted. Was Margaret really thinking about including her in her will? That possibility hadn't crossed her mind. To her, being there was a temporary refuge, a place where she could help Margaret in her final days, and maybe find some peace for herself. But if what Alice was saying was true, the situation was much more complicated than she had imagined. "It's not certain that she will," Victor responded, his tone colder than before. "And if she does, it won't happen without problems. Trust me, Alice. I'm working on it. This girl won't be a threat to us. Whatever Margaret does or doesn't do will be within what I consider acceptable." Victor's words were clear. He was willing to manipulate the situation to ensure that nothing changed in his control over Margaret's affairs. To him, Olivia was nothing more than an intruder threatening his position, someone he needed to manage before she became a real obstacle. Olivia slowly stepped back, making sure not to make any noise. Her heart was pounding as she moved away from the door. She knew she couldn't stay there to listen any longer. The situation was becoming more tense by the minute, and though Margaret had assured her she was safe in her home, Olivia was beginning to doubt the true security that place offered her. She headed to the back garden, needing fresh air to clear her mind. As she sat on a bench beneath a large tree, she began to process what she had heard. Alice and Victor saw her as a threat, and now Olivia had more questions than answers. Why was Margaret considering changing her will? Was it because of the bond they had formed, or was there something more that Margaret hadn't told her? As she pondered all this, she heard footsteps approaching. It was Margaret, walking towards her with a calm smile, supported by her cane. Despite her fragility, the elderly woman still exuded an unshakable dignity. "I'm glad to find you here, dear," Margaret said as she sat down next to Olivia. "This garden has always been my refuge when I need to think. I suppose you need some of that too, don't you?" Olivia smiled, though her mind was still agitated by what she had just overheard. "Yes, ma'am, it's a peaceful place," she replied, trying to hide her concern. Margaret glanced at her sideways as if she could sense something was bothering her. "What's troubling you, Olivia?" Margaret asked kindly. "You can talk to me, you know that." Olivia tensed up. She didn't know if she should tell Margaret what she had overheard, though she felt a growing bond with the elderly woman. She couldn't be sure how she would react if she knew that Alice and Victor were manipulating her, or at least trying to. However, before she could say anything, Margaret gently took her hand. "I want you to know something," Margaret said, her voice calm but filled with seriousness. "Since you arrived here, I've felt something I haven't felt in a long time. Genuine companionship. I don't want you to worry about what may be happening around you. This house is full of tensions and secrets. I know that better than anyone. But what matters is that you're here with me. You don't have to be afraid, dear. I'll protect you from anything that tries to harm you." Margaret's words, though comforting, didn't fully dispel Olivia's worries. She knew that, despite Margaret's promise, the forces at play in the mansion were powerful. Victor wouldn't stop easily if he felt his control was at risk, and Alice, though more emotionally connected to Margaret, wasn't on her side either. Olivia decided not to tell Margaret what she had overheard, at least not for now. She knew she had to be careful and keep her eyes wide open. She wasn't willing to be a victim of the power games Alice and Victor were playing. "Thank you, Margaret," she finally said, forcing a small smile. "I'm glad to be here with you." Margaret returned the smile, squeezing her hand gently before struggling to stand up again. "I know, dear, and believe me, this house is better with you in it," she said before slowly walking back to the mansion, leaving Olivia with her thoughts. When Margaret disappeared into the house, Olivia took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't ignore what she had just overheard. If Victor and Alice were willing to manipulate Margaret to protect their own interests, then Olivia would have to be prepared for whatever came next. It was no longer just about keeping an elderly woman company in her final days. Now Olivia was in the middle of a battle for control over a fortune, and more importantly, for the truth. As the sun began to set on the horizon, Olivia felt the path ahead of her becoming more uncertain. The tension in the mansion was growing, and though she couldn't predict what would happen, she knew she would have to face it with strength and determination. The atmosphere in the McAllister mansion had shifted. Olivia couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger surrounding her. Alice and Victor's words still echoed in her mind, and though she tried to carry on with her routine, she felt something dark was about to unfold. It was clear that her presence had disrupted the balance in the house, and that Victor and Alice saw her as a threat. But what troubled Olivia most was the growing mystery surrounding Charles's death, Margaret's son. Over the days, Margaret had spoken several times about her son, but each time she mentioned his death, her voice trembled slightly, and some details seemed confusing. Olivia, who had learned to read between the lines after living on the streets, knew that something didn't quite add up. She decided it was time to start looking for answers, not just for Margaret, but for herself as well. She felt there was something deeper, something being intentionally hidden. One night, while everyone in the mansion slept, Olivia decided it was the right time to start her investigation. She knew that the mansion's library held documents and files that might contain valuable information. She quietly got out of bed and wrapped herself in a sweater to shield herself from the cold that invaded the mansion at night. Moving carefully through the dark hallways, she reached the door of the library. Upon entering, the soft moonlight filtered through the tall windows, partially illuminating the shelves filled with old books and folders. The room had a smell of aged paper and wood. Olivia began searching through the shelves, focusing on the files that seemed to contain important McAllister family documents. Though she wasn't sure what she was looking for, she knew that somehow she would find something that would help her understand the truth behind Charles's death. After sifting through several files without success, she found one that seemed different from the others. The title was simple: Charles McAllister, personal. Her heart began to race. She opened it with trembling hands and began reading the first documents. There were medical reports, bank statements, and a series of legal correspondences. Though most of the papers seemed innocuous, something about the sequence of events puzzled her. According to the documents, Charles had been involved in several financial troubles in the months leading up to his death. There were investment decisions that didn't match the profile of someone as meticulous as him, decisions that had led him to lose a significant amount of money in a short period of time. Olivia realized that Victor had been heavily involved in these dealings, which further raised her suspicions. Had Charles been manipulated by his own lawyer? Could Victor have been behind those decisions that led to the tragedy? Olivia kept reading and found something that left her frozen. A letter from Charles to Margaret, written a few days before his death. The letter was confusing, almost desperate. Charles spoke of feeling trapped, of having made mistakes he couldn't escape from, and though he didn't give explicit details, he mentioned fearing for his life. The last line of the letter echoed in Olivia's mind like a haunting refrain. "Mom, there are things you don't understand. I've done something terrible, and now I don't know how to escape from it." Olivia stared at the letter, unable to fully process what she was reading. Charles had known something was wrong before he died, and that letter seemed like some kind of confession. But what exactly had he done? And why did he seem to fear someone or something? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but crucial parts were still missing. Something terrible had happened, and it seemed that Victor was more involved than Margaret could have ever imagined. Footsteps in the hallway pulled her from her thoughts. Olivia quickly turned off the lamp she had lit and hid the folder. She listened intently, hoping it was just a passing sound, but the footsteps grew closer. Someone was coming towards the library. Olivia, her heart racing, hid behind a bookshelf, trying to hold her breath. The door slowly creaked open, and a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Alice. The nurse entered with a serious, worried expression, as if she was looking for something. Olivia watched from her hiding spot, wondering if Alice was also involved in the mystery surrounding Charles's death. Alice walked over to one of the desks and began searching through some papers, muttering something under her breath. After a few minutes, she picked up what looked like a document and headed towards the door. Olivia couldn't see what it was, but something told her that whatever Alice had taken was related to her investigation. When Alice left the library, Olivia waited a few seconds before moving. She knew she had to be more cautious from now on. Alice was clearly aware of something important, and Victor, with his control over the family's finances, was manipulating the situation in his favor. Olivia felt that the web of secrets in the McAllister mansion was much darker and deeper than she had ever imagined. Back in her room, Olivia lay down on her bed, but her mind couldn't rest. Charles's letter kept playing over and over in her head. She knew there was something very important that she had yet to discover, but she was getting closer to the truth. Charles hadn't died from a simple accident, that much was clear. He had been pushed, manipulated, and possibly betrayed. But by whom and why was still a mystery. The following days, Olivia remained alert, watching every move Alice and Victor made, looking for any clue that would help her better understand what was happening in the mansion. Margaret, for her part, continued to trust them, unaware that the people around her were not what they seemed. Olivia knew that she would have to uncover the truth herself before it was too late, and though she didn't know how she would do it, she was determined to protect Margaret no matter the cost. The next days were a constant test for Olivia. Though she tried to stay calm and carry on with her routine in the mansion, the discovery of Charles's letter and Alice's strange actions had planted a deep unease in her heart. The truth seemed closer every day, but so did the danger. Olivia felt like she was walking a tightrope, knowing that one misstep could lead to irreversible consequences. Margaret, for her part, didn't seem to notice the growing tension in the house. She continued spending her days in her chair, talking with Olivia and reminiscing about her son. But every time she mentioned Charles, Olivia couldn't help but notice the gaps in her stories, the things Margaret either didn't know or couldn't understand. The elderly woman's pain was real, but Olivia began to wonder just how much Margaret had been kept in the dark, by the very people who were supposed to be looking after her. One afternoon, after accompanying Margaret on her daily walk through the garden, Olivia decided it was time to confront Alice. She knew the nurse was hiding something important, and while she didn't expect Alice to give up answers easily, Olivia felt that the silence had to be broken before things spiraled even further out of control. She waited until Margaret retired to her room to rest and then went looking for Alice. She found her in the kitchen, preparing a cup of tea, as if nothing unusual was happening in the house. Olivia watched her for a few seconds before taking a deep breath and stepping forward. "Alice," Olivia said in a firm yet calm tone. Alice looked up, surprised by Olivia's sudden approach. Her expression, though polite, showed a brief flash of discomfort. "Is something wrong?" Alice asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Olivia didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know there's something you're not telling me. Something about Charles, about what really happened before his death." Alice blinked, clearly taken aback by Olivia's directness. For a brief moment, the nurse seemed unsure, but quickly regained her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about, Olivia," Alice replied coldly, turning her attention back to her cup of tea. "Charles's death was a tragic accident. There's nothing more to say about it." "That's not true," Olivia insisted, stepping closer. "I found a letter from Charles. He was worried, scared. Something was wrong before he died, and you know it." Alice set her cup down on the table with a soft but noticeable thud. For the first time, her face showed a mix of concern and tension. She turned to Olivia, her previously controlled gaze now flickering with nervousness. "You shouldn't have found that letter," Alice said, her voice low and restrained. "It wasn't meant for you." "Maybe it wasn't, but I found it," Olivia replied, holding her ground. "And now I want to know the truth. What really happened? Why did Charles distance himself from Margaret before his death?" Alice exhaled deeply, as if the weight of what she was about to say was unbearable. For a moment, Olivia thought the nurse wouldn't say anything, but then, in a barely audible tone, Alice began to speak. "Charles got involved in something he never should have. He got into financial trouble, serious trouble, and Victor helped him, or at least that's what Charles believed." The mention of Victor made Olivia's stomach churn. She had already suspected, but hearing his direct involvement in Charles's problems only deepened her distrust. "Did Victor manipulate him?" Olivia asked, narrowing her eyes. "Did he have something to do with Charles's death?" Alice shook her head, but not with the certainty Olivia had expected. "I don't know. I can't say for sure. All I know is that Charles started to change after Victor got involved in his financial affairs. There was so much pressure on him to keep the company afloat, to carry on the family legacy. But something went wrong, and when things started spiraling out of control, Charles realized he was in over his head." Alice paused, as if the next thought was hard to admit. "Shortly before his death, Charles told me he no longer trusted Victor, that there was something off about the way he was handling business." A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Everything Alice was saying confirmed her worst fears. Charles hadn't died in a simple accident. He had been pushed into a situation that overwhelmed him, and Victor had played a part in his downfall. "Why didn't you tell Margaret?" Olivia asked, her voice hardening. "Why didn't you warn her?" Alice lowered her gaze, unable to meet Olivia's eyes. "Because at that time I didn't know who to trust either. Victor is cunning. He's been in charge of Margaret's finances for so long that even I began to doubt my own instincts. Besides, Margaret was devastated by Charles's death. I didn't want to cause her more pain." Olivia felt a surge of anger mixed with frustration. Margaret had been deceived, manipulated, and kept in the dark by the people who were supposed to protect her. Alice, though she seemed remorseful, had been part of that cover-up, whether out of fear or confusion. "You need to tell Margaret the truth," Olivia said, with renewed firmness in her voice. "She's suffered enough from lies and secrets. You can't keep protecting Victor. He's dangerous." Alice looked up, her eyes filled with fear and doubt. "And what do you think Margaret will do if we tell her all of this?" Alice asked. "She's so fragile, Olivia. I don't know if she can handle it." "Don't underestimate Margaret," Olivia replied. "She's stronger than you think, and she has the right to know what really happened to her son. If you don't tell her the truth, I will." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Alice seemed to be waging an internal battle, torn between fear of the consequences and her duty to Margaret. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right," Alice whispered. "We'll tell her. But we need to be careful. Victor won't just sit back if he finds out we're investigating him." Olivia nodded, knowing Alice was right. Despite the small victory of getting Alice to talk, there was still much to be done. Victor wasn't the kind of man who would easily let himself be exposed, and if he had come this far, he wouldn't hesitate to take measures to protect himself. That night, Olivia returned to her room with her mind full of thoughts. The truth was beginning to surface, but she knew the danger had only increased. The confrontation with Alice was just the first step in a much bigger battle, one that involved secrets that had been buried for years. As she lay in bed, her resolve solidified. She was willing to fight for Margaret and for the truth, no matter the consequences, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. Alice was now on her side, but would it be enough to face someone as cunning as Victor? The day had come. Olivia knew she could no longer wait to tell Margaret the truth. After the confrontation with Alice, they had agreed it was time for Margaret to know what had really happened with Charles and the role Victor had played in his life. However, as Olivia walked toward Margaret's room that afternoon, an uneasy feeling crept over her. She knew what she was about to reveal might break the elderly woman. Margaret had built her life around the memories of her son, but those memories were tainted by the lies of the people around her. Alice waited outside the room, arms crossed, a worried expression on her face. Though they both agreed Margaret needed to know the truth, Alice still feared for the elderly woman's health. Olivia shared that concern, but knew that silence was no longer an option. Margaret deserved to know what had been hidden from her for so many years. "Are you ready?" Alice asked quietly. Olivia nodded, taking a deep breath. "There's no turning back now." Alice slowly opened the door and Olivia stepped into the room. Margaret was seated in her chair, gazing out the window as she often did, lost in thought. Upon hearing the soft noise of the door, she turned her head and smiled warmly when she saw Olivia. "Ah, dear, I'm glad to see you," Margaret said with a warmth that contrasted with the tension Olivia felt inside. "How have you been today?" Olivia walked over slowly, her heart pounding. She sat down in the chair beside Margaret, and for a moment the words seemed stuck in her throat. She didn't know how to begin. Margaret noticed Olivia's discomfort and frowned slightly. "Is something wrong, Olivia?" Margaret asked, concerned. Olivia looked down, nervously playing with her hands before speaking. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you," she began in a shaky voice. "Something about Charles. Something I think you need to know." Margaret's expression changed immediately. Her son's name always affected her, and Olivia could see the tension in the elderly woman's face. Still, Margaret maintained her composure and nodded slowly. "What is it about?" Margaret asked, though there was a slight hesitation in her voice. Olivia took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say what she was about to reveal. "I've been investigating Charles's death, and I've found things I don't think you knew, things that have been kept from you for a long time." Olivia paused for a moment to make sure Margaret was ready to hear. "Charles wasn't well before he died. He was involved in very serious financial problems, and Victor was behind many of his decisions." Margaret squinted, as if she couldn't fully comprehend what Olivia was telling her. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with uncertainty. Olivia continued before Margaret could respond. "Victor manipulated him, pushed him into decisions that ruined him, and when Charles began to realize what was happening, it was already too late." Olivia gently took Margaret's hand, trying to offer some comfort. "I found a letter Charles wrote to you shortly before he died. He was scared, Margaret. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to get out of the situation." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she heard this. For a moment it seemed like the elderly woman would completely break down. She closed her eyes tightly, as if she wanted to block out Olivia's words, as if hearing the truth was too painful. "What are you saying?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Victor, he manipulated him?" Olivia nodded, moved by Margaret's evident pain. "Yes, Margaret, and not just that. I believe Victor is involved in Charles's death in a more direct way than we imagined. It wasn't just an accident. There are too many things that don't add up." Margaret opened her eyes, and the brightness in her gaze faded, replaced by a mix of confusion, pain, and restrained anger. "I've trusted Victor all these years," she said, her voice shaking. How could I have been so blind?" Olivia gently squeezed Margaret's hand, unsure of what else to say to console her. At that moment, Alice entered the room, having waited for Olivia to take the first step. Her face was serious, but there was evident compassion in her eyes. "Margaret, all of this is true," Alice said softly. "I've witnessed many things I didn't fully understand at the time, but now I see it clearly. Victor has been playing all of us. He's been manipulating your family's finances for a long time, and when Charles started asking questions, he became a threat to him." Margaret brought a hand to her mouth, unable to hold back a sob. Victor's betrayal was too painful to process. For years, she had trusted him, depended on his advice and loyalty, and now everything was falling apart before her eyes. Her mind kept returning to the moments when she had felt lost after her son's death, blindly trusting Victor to handle everything. "I can't believe it," Margaret murmured, tears streaming down her face. "Charles, Victor." Alice knelt beside her, taking her other hand. "I know this is hard, Margaret. I can't imagine the pain you must be feeling right now. But it's better for you to know the truth, even if it's painful. We can't keep living under Victor's lies." Margaret nodded weakly, but her gaze remained distant, trying to grasp the magnitude of what she had just heard. It was as if all the pieces of her life, all the certainties she had built around her son's death were crumbling before her eyes. "And now what?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "What am I supposed to do with this information? I can't change what happened. I can't bring Charles back." Olivia looked at Margaret with a mix of compassion and determination. "No, we can't change the past," Olivia said, "but we can make Victor pay for what he did. He's been controlling your life, manipulating everything to his advantage. If we don't do something now, he'll keep doing it. We have to confront him, Margaret. You're not alone in this. Alice and I are with you." Margaret looked up, her eyes shining with tears. The sadness and pain were still there, but Olivia could see something else beginning to emerge. A spark of determination, a will not to let Victor win this battle. "You're right, Olivia," Margaret said in a faint voice. "I can't sit here feeling sorry for myself. I have to do something. For Charles. And for me." Olivia nodded, relieved to see that despite her pain, Margaret was willing to fight. "We're not going to let Victor keep manipulating you," Alice said, backing Olivia up. "But we have to be careful. He has a lot of power over your affairs, and we don't know how far he's willing to go to protect it." Margaret nodded, whipping away her tears with a handkerchief. "I know," she sighed, "and I'm ready to face whatever comes. I can't keep living in the shadow of his betrayal. It's time to take back control of my life." The plan was in motion. Margaret, Olivia, and Alice knew it wouldn't be easy, but now they had more than just pain and distrust. They had a cause to fight for, and none of them were willing to give up. Victor had woven his web of lies for far too long, but those lies were about to unravel. The atmosphere in the McAllister mansion was heavy with an invisible but palpable tension. After the devastating revelation Margaret had received about Victor and her son's death, Olivia and Alice knew there was no turning back. The next step was to confront Victor, but they couldn't do so without a concrete plan. Despite her frailty, Margaret was determined to expose the man who had betrayed her trust for so many years. But they knew they couldn't act impulsively. Victor was cunning and had control over many aspects of Margaret's life, including her finances. The day after the revelation, Olivia met with Alice in the library, both aware that they needed to be strategic. While Margaret rested, trying to recover from the emotional shock, Alice and Olivia knew time was working against them. If Victor suspected anything, he might take drastic measures to protect himself. "We can't confront him directly," Alice said quietly, as she reviewed some financial documents they had found on the library desk. "Victor controls all of Margaret's legal documents, her investments, everything. If we confront him without solid proof, he could destroy any evidence before we can act." Olivia nodded, her mind working quickly. She had been clever enough to uncover some of Victor's financial manipulations, but they needed something stronger, something that couldn't be refuted. She knew they had to dismantle his web from within. "We need something to incriminate him," Olivia whispered, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her. "If we can find proof that he's been diverting funds or mishandling Margaret's finances, we can expose him. But we have to move quickly. If he realizes we're investigating him, he could destroy any trace of his involvement." Alice nodded, her expression serious. "There's something that's always seemed strange to me," she said after a brief pause. "Margaret once told me that Charles had mentioned a bank account he could never locate, one that Victor was supposedly managing. If we can find that account, we might discover more about what really happened before Charles died." Olivia's face lit up at the idea. A secret bank account could be exactly the key they needed to uncover Victor's secrets, but it also posed a huge risk. They knew Victor would have everything well hidden, and any attempt to trace that account could raise suspicions. "All right," Olivia said, "let's start by looking for any clue that could lead us to that account. He may have left something behind in the mansion's documents. If we find anything, we'll use it to confront him at the right time." With a plan in motion, the two women began sifting through the McAllister family files, searching for any sign of suspicious activity. Alice, who had worked with Margaret for years, had access to many private documents that Margaret had entrusted to Victor, never questioning their legitimacy. For hours, they combed through bills, contracts, and financial statements, looking for any pattern or irregularity that could incriminate Victor. Several hours passed, and just as Olivia began to think their efforts were in vain, she found something that caught her eye. A document, tucked between some of the oldest folders, showed a significant transfer of money to a numbered foreign account, with no clear explanation of the transaction's purpose. Charles's name appeared as the signatory, but the signature seemed slightly different from the others. "Alice, look at this," Olivia said, handing her the document. Alice studied it closely, her eyes narrowing as she read the details. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured. "Margaret never mentioned this transaction, and Charles's signature, it doesn't look like his. At least, not entirely." Olivia felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized what they had in their hands. If that signature had been forged and the money diverted to an account controlled by Victor, they would have undeniable proof that he had been manipulating Charles from the start. They knew Victor was meticulous enough to cover his tracks, but this seemed like a slip-up, a crack in his perfect facade. "This is our first step," Olivia said, a mix of excitement and caution in her voice. "We need to investigate this account further. If we can trace the money and link it directly to Victor, we'll have something real against him." Alice nodded, knowing they were making progress, even if it was in small steps. "We should be discreet," Alice warned. "If Victor realizes we're snooping into his business, he'll do everything he can to destroy the evidence. And if we're too late, we might lose our only chance." Olivia knew this, but she also felt they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Despite Margaret's fragility, she was ready to take action once they had something solid against Victor. They couldn't afford to fail, not with Margaret's future and Charles's legacy at stake. As the day wore on, and they continued searching through more documents, Olivia couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Though they were making progress, they knew they were playing a dangerous game. Victor wasn't someone who would go down without a fight, and if he discovered what they were doing, he wouldn't hesitate to take drastic measures. By nightfall, Margaret joined them in the library, her face still marked by grief but with a renewed sense of determination. "Have you found anything?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Olivia handed her the document she had found. "We believe this transaction is linked to an account Charles wasn't fully aware of, possibly controlled by Victor. The signature doesn't appear to be authentic, and if we can trace this account, we might have proof that Victor has been diverting funds for years." Margaret looked at the document, her hands trembling slightly as she held it. After a few moments, she looked up, her eyes shining with a mix of sadness and resolve. "I don't know how I was so blind for so long," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "But not anymore. If Victor is behind this, I'll do everything in my power to make him face the consequences." Olivia nodded, seeing the strength in Margaret. She knew the battle was far from over, but with Margaret determined to confront her betrayer, they had a real chance of winning. "The next step will be to track down that account," Alice said. "We'll need external help, someone who can do it without raising suspicion. Do you know anyone we can trust? Margaret thought for a moment before responding. I know someone, an old friend of my late husband. He's not on good terms with Victor and might be willing to help us, as long as we keep this quiet until we have concrete evidence. Olivia and Alice exchanged glances. They had a plan, a clear direction, and allies they could trust. But they also knew that Victor wouldn't remain idle if he suspected anything. That night, as the three women plotted their next move, Olivia felt the battle was just beginning. Victor's control over the McAllister family was unraveling, but they still had a long way to go. The web of lies he had spun over the years was starting to tear apart, and soon, very soon, everything would be revealed. The tension in the McAllister mansion had reached its peak. Margaret, Olivia, and Alice knew that what was at stake was more than just a confrontation with Victor. They were trying to dismantle a web of deceit that had lasted for years. But as they got closer to the truth, the risk grew. They knew Victor wouldn't sit idly by, especially if he discovered they were investigating him. After the meeting in the library, Margaret reached out to her old friend, George Miller, a financial expert who had been close to her late husband. Margaret trusted that George could help them trace the secret account and uncover the full extent of Victor's manipulations. The plan was simple. George would use his network of contacts in the financial world to locate the account and verify if Victor had diverted funds to it. Everything had to be done in secret without raising suspicions. The next morning, George arrived at the mansion. He was an older man, but with a sharp look and an air of confidence. After a brief, cordial greeting, Margaret explained the situation. George, though surprised, was willing to help. I always knew Victor wasn't someone to be trusted, George said, as he reviewed the documents Margaret and Olivia had shown him. But I never imagined he'd be capable of something like this. Let me make a few calls. If that account exists, I'll find it. As George began his investigation, Olivia and Alice focused on making sure Victor didn't catch on to what they were doing. Every day that passed, the tension increased. Victor continued to manage Margaret's finances, confident that his position was secure. However, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was beginning to suspect something. One day, as Olivia walked down the mansion's hallway, she crossed paths with Victor. The man, always impeccable and distant, looked at her with more intensity than usual. There was something in his gaze that made her stop. A glimmer of distrust, perhaps even suspicion. Olivia, Victor said softly, but with a veiled threat in his tone, you've been spending a lot of time with Mrs. McAllister lately. I hope everything is in order. Olivia, keeping her composure, met his gaze. Margaret needs company, Olivia replied, keeping her tone neutral. I'm just trying to make her feel better during these difficult times. Victor smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm glad to hear that, he said. Margaret is a strong woman, but also vulnerable right now. I hope everyone around her has her best interests at heart. Olivia felt his words were a warning. Though he hadn't said it outright, Victor was making it clear he was watching her closely. Olivia knew she had to be more careful. When Victor walked away, Olivia went straight to find Alice. She told her about the conversation with Victor, and their suspicions grew. They were in a race against time. If Victor discovered what they were doing before they had proof, he could destroy any evidence that incriminated him. We can't sit around waiting, Olivia said anxiously. If Victor is starting to suspect, he might already be taking steps to protect himself. Alice nodded, concerned. We need to push George to move faster. We can't risk Victor finding out what we're doing before we have something concrete. That same afternoon, Margaret met with George for an update on his investigation. George had been working tirelessly to trace the account, and he finally had something to share. I've found the account, George said, his expression serious. It's registered under Charles McAllister's name, but recent activity suggests someone else has been operating it since his death. Margaret, Olivia, and Alice exchanged looks. They knew what this meant. Victor, Margaret murmured, a mix of pain and anger in her voice. He's been using that account to divert money all this time. Exactly, George continued, but there's more. I've traced several significant transactions to accounts in tax havens. This points to a complex network of money laundering and tax evasion. Victor wasn't just stealing from Margaret, he was running a much bigger scheme than we imagined. Olivia felt the air in the room grow heavier. Victor's actions hadn't just destroyed Charles, they had also endangered the McAllister family's legacy. Margaret, though visibly shaken, remained firm. "Can we prove all this?" Margaret asked, her voice tinged with barely contained desperation. George nodded. "Yes. I have all the documentation we need to show that Victor has been diverting money and running this operation, but we need to be careful. If he suspects we're about to expose him, he could flee or destroy whatever evidence is left." Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the magnitude of what she had just heard. Olivia could see the pain in her eyes, but also the resolve. "I can't believe I trusted him for so long," Margaret said, almost whispering to herself. "Charles died thinking he had failed, and it was all because of Victor." "It's not too late to set this right," Olivia said firmly. "We have the evidence, and with it, we can expose Victor. But we need to do it strategically." The plan quickly began to take shape. George suggested they gather all the evidence and present it to a trusted lawyer to start a legal case against Victor. He also suggested they alert financial authorities, who could freeze the accounts involved in Victor's scheme. But they knew they couldn't act immediately without tipping Victor off. "We need to distract him," Alice said, who had been listening attentively. "If he thinks we're preoccupied with other matters, maybe he won't suspect we're preparing to bring him down." Olivia agreed. "We can make everything seem normal. I don't want him to know we're onto him until it's too late." That night, the three women met privately, fine-tuning the plan. They knew they had to act quickly and precisely. George would take charge of contacting a lawyer who could handle the case discreetly, while Olivia and Alice would continue with their usual roles in the mansion, pretending everything was under control. However, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closer than they realized. Every time she saw Victor walking through the mansion, she felt their time was running out. But there was something more at stake now. It wasn't just about Margaret's legacy or the money Victor had stolen. It was about Charles's dignity, the truth about his death, and the fact that finally justice might catch up to him. As they prepared for the final showdown with Victor, Olivia knew there was no room for error. The web of lies he had spun was beginning to unravel, but with a man like Victor, the risk of everything going wrong was too great. The truth was about to come to light, but with that truth would also come consequences, and Olivia knew that once they took the next step, there would be no turning back. The hours following the discovery of the secret account were filled with tense silence. Every member of the McAllister household continued with their usual routines, but Olivia, Margaret, and Alice knew they were in the final stages of their plan. They had solid evidence, documents that incriminated Victor, and could bring an end to his control over the family. However, they also knew that a direct confrontation with him could be risky, especially if Victor realized what they were about to do. The plan to distract Victor was in motion. Alice and Olivia continued to keep up appearances, making everything seem normal. Meanwhile, George worked discreetly with a lawyer to ensure that once they presented the evidence, financial authorities could freeze Victor's accounts. It was a delicate process, but if everything went according to plan, they would have Victor trapped with no way out. That afternoon, Margaret sat in her room reflecting on everything that had happened. She knew that Victor's betrayal had been devastating, not only for the money he had stolen, but also for the way he had manipulated her son, Charles, driving him to the brink of despair before his tragic death. But now, with Olivia and Alice by her side, Margaret was determined to take back control of her life and her family's legacy. As Margaret mentally prepared herself for what was to come, Alice and Olivia decided to take the final step, confronting Victor. They needed to do it carefully, to avoid alerting him to the fact that they had already gathered enough evidence to expose him. They knew that any wrong move could lead Victor to destroy more evidence or flee before they had a chance to trap him. That same night, Olivia approached Victor's office, where he often worked late. The door was slightly ajar, and the sound of typing filled the air. Victor was focused on his computer, as if everything in his world was under control. Olivia knocked gently on the door before entering. "Do you have a moment, Victor?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Victor looked up, surprised to see her. "Of course, Olivia," he responded, turning off his computer screen. "What can I do for you?" Olivia walked to the desk, doing her best to hide her nerves. She knew what she was about to do was risky, but she needed to get Victor into a position where he would lower his guard. She sat across from him, looking directly into his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about Margaret's situation," Olivia began, "and I can't help but worry about her health and future. I know you've been handling her finances for years, and I wanted to know if there's anything more we can do to make sure Margaret is well taken care of." Victor frowned slightly, as if trying to read between the lines. "I've been managing everything responsibly," he said with a calculated smile. "Margaret trusts me completely, and I've done everything in my power to ensure her well-being." Olivia nodded, pretending to agree. "I know," she said, "but with everything that's happened lately, I'd just feel more comfortable if we could review any accounts or investments, just to make sure everything is in order." Victor blinked, visibly uncomfortable with the question. He knew something wasn't right, but he still couldn't figure out what it was. "There's nothing out of the ordinary," he replied, but Olivia noticed a slight tremor in his voice. "Everything is where it should be." Olivia decided to press a little further. "It's just that Margaret has been worried about a few things. She mentioned an account Charles talked about before he died. Do you know anything about that?" Victor's face immediately hardened. Charles's name had always been a sensitive topic, but this time the mention of the account seemed to rattle him. Olivia could see the flash of fear in his eyes, even though he tried to hide it. "Charles," Victor began, but his voice faltered slightly before he regained his composure. "I'm not sure what account you're referring to. Charles was under a lot of pressure before his death, and sometimes he said things that didn't make sense." Olivia held his gaze, knowing Victor was lying. "I think Margaret would feel more at ease if we reviewed that account," Olivia said softly. "Just to make sure everything's okay." Victor leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of calculated coldness. "Olivia," he said, his voice low but firm, "I don't know what Margaret's been telling you, but trust me when I say there's nothing to review. Everything is in perfect order." Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she was treading on thin ice, but she couldn't let Victor intimidate her. "I understand," she replied, standing up from her chair. "I just wanted to make sure Margaret didn't have any more worries. Thank you for your time, Victor." Victor nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on her as she left the room. He knew something was wrong, and Olivia had sensed it in every word they exchanged. That night, Olivia and Alice discussed the encounter with Victor. They knew he was beginning to suspect, but they also knew they were close to exposing him. With the evidence George had gathered and the lawyer ready to act, it was only a matter of time before they made their move. The next morning, while Margaret was having breakfast with Olivia and Alice, George called. He had finalized the last details with the lawyer and financial authorities. They were ready to act. Victor's accounts would be frozen, and within hours his entire scheme would be exposed. "It's time," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I can't wait any longer. We must confront Victor." Olivia and Alice exchanged glances, knowing the final confrontation was near. The plan was in motion, and although they knew it would be a tough battle, they were ready. The confrontation was set for that afternoon. With everything in place, the three women knew it was time to face Victor and reveal the truth. Afternoon arrived and tension filled the McAllister mansion. Margaret, Olivia, and Alice were about to confront Victor with the truth, something they had waited for so long. The evidence was ready. Victor's accounts had been frozen, and George, along with the lawyer, was waiting to initiate legal proceedings. The calm before the storm engulfed everything, but the feeling of looming danger was undeniable. Margaret, though visibly tired, remained steadfast. She knew this was her moment, the instant she would regain control of her life and legacy, and above all, seek justice for her son, Charles. Alice and Olivia stood by her, knowing that what was about to happen would not be easy, but it was inevitable. Alice went to fetch Victor, who was still working in his office, unaware of the storm brewing. When he entered the room, his expression was a mixture of surprise and unease, likely sensing that something was amiss. "Margaret, Olivia, Alice," he said with a tense smile. "What's going on? Why such a formal meeting?" Margaret remained silent. her gaze hard and cold as Olivia stepped forward. She knew it was time to speak, to set in motion the plan they had meticulously prepared. "Victor," Olivia began, keeping her tone firm, "today, everything comes to an end. We know what you've been doing all this time. The lies, the manipulation, and the way you stole Charles' future, everything has been revealed." Victor blinked, clearly thrown by Olivia's words. His smile faltered, but he tried to stay calm. "What are you talking about, Olivia?" he responded with a nervous laugh. "Everything I've done has been for Margaret and her family. You have no idea how business works." Margaret interrupted, her voice strong and resolute. "No more lies, Victor," she said, slamming her hand on the table with surprising force for someone her age. "I entrusted you with my life, my son's life, and you betrayed him. You destroyed everything Charles had built. And now we have gathered all the evidence we need to prove it." Olivia handed Margaret the folder with documents incriminating Victor. Margaret held them in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. The tension in the room was suffocating. Victor, upon seeing the folder, started to get nervous. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead, but he tried to maintain his composure. "This is nothing but a setup," he said, his voice wavering. "You have no proof of what you're saying. This is all a misunderstanding." Alice, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "It's no misunderstanding, Victor. We found the secret accounts, the illegal transfers, and we found Charles's letter, where he mentions you directly. He knew what you were doing. And now, so do we." Victor's face darkened at the mention of Charles's name. He knew he was cornered, but instead of surrendering, something in him changed. His posture tensed, and his once controlled face began to show uncontrollable fury. "You don't understand anything!" Victor shouted, slamming his fists on the table. "Everything I did was for this family. Charles was useless, a weakling. If it weren't for me, this family would have fallen into ruin." Olivia took a step back, surprised by Victor's outburst of anger. Margaret, shocked, looked at him in horror. What are you saying?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor, enraged, stepped toward Margaret, his eyes burning with anger. "Charles didn't deserve anything. He wasn't strong enough to run this company. You coddled him, made him weak. If it hadn't been for me, everything would have been lost." Olivia instinctively moved between Victor and Margaret, sensing the danger in the air. "Stay away from her," Olivia exclaimed firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. Victor, completely out of control, shoved her forcefully, making her stumble backward. Alice rushed to help Olivia, trying to steady her, but Victor's fury seemed limitless. "Don't tell me what to do," Victor screamed, his eyes wild, as he took another step toward Margaret. "This fortune is mine. I worked for it more than any of you." Margaret, who had remained calm until then, stood up, holding her cane, her face a mix of pain and determination. "Charles trusted you because he believed in you," Margaret said, her voice trembling but full of resolve. "And you betrayed him. Now, you will pay for everything you've done." Victor, unable to control his anger, raised his fist as if to strike Margaret, but before he could do anything, Alice and Olivia lunged at him, trying to stop him. "Enough!" Olivia yelled as she struggled to restrain him. In the midst of the chaos, the door to the room burst open. The police officers, along with George and the lawyer, quickly entered the room. Seeing the scene, the officers moved swiftly, restraining Victor as he tried to resist. "Let me go. You don't understand anything. I've worked my whole life for this family," Victor shouted, struggling as the officers handcuffed him. One of the officers pinned him against the table, and finally, after a fierce struggle, they managed to control him. "Victor Martinez," the officer said firmly, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and assault. You have the right to remain silent." Victor, exhausted and defeated, stopped struggling. His eyes, once full of rage, now only showed hatred and bitterness. As they led him away, he cast one last look of disdain at Margaret. "This isn't over, Margaret," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll pay for this." The door closed behind him, and the room fell into a deep silence. Margaret, exhausted from the confrontation, collapsed into her chair, her hands trembling. "It's done," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Finally. It's done." Olivia, still recovering from the impact of the shove, approached Margaret and took her hand. "You did it?" Olivia said softly. "It's all over now." Margaret, her eyes filled with tears, nodded slowly. She knew the road to healing would be long, but at least the weight of Victor's lies was no longer on her shoulders. Alice joined them, placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We did the right thing," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Charles can rest in peace now." And in the silence that followed, the three women understood that, though the pain of betrayal still lingered, they had triumphed over the shadows Victor had cast on their lives. The McAllister mansion was left in an eerie silence after Victor's chaotic arrest. Margaret, still shaken by the violence of the encounter, rested in her room, surrounded by a calm she hadn't felt in a long time. Though the weight of Victor's betrayal lingered, she knew that at last her fight had borne fruit. Olivia and Alice stayed close, aware that although the battle was over, the emotional wounds would take time to heal. That morning, Olivia awoke with a feeling of relief and exhaustion. The past few days had been a test of emotional and physical endurance, but there was something different in the air. Victor's shadow no longer loomed over the mansion, and the future, though uncertain, appeared much clearer. Olivia went downstairs to the dining room, where she found Alice making breakfast. "How's Margaret?" Olivia asked, sitting at the table. Alice sighed, serving a cup of tea. "She's better, but she's still processing everything that happened. After yesterday, it's understandable." Alice paused, looking out the window. "But I think deep down she already knew the truth about Victor. She just needed to face it." Olivia nodded silently. There was something profoundly transformative about Margaret finally facing the truth about Victor. For years, he had been a figure of trust, someone in whom Margaret had placed her blind faith. Breaking that illusion had been painful, but also liberating. "The important thing is that now she has the chance to heal," Olivia said, taking a sip of her tea. "And she's not alone. We'll help her rebuild what Victor destroyed." Alice nodded, grateful for Olivia's words. They both knew the recovery process would be long, but the first step had already been taken. Now, they had to focus on the future and how to support Margaret as she began to pick up the pieces of her life. A few hours later, Olivia decided to visit Margaret in her room. When she opened the door, she found the elderly woman sitting by the window, gazing out at the garden. Sunlight streamed in gently, illuminating her face. Though there were still traces of sadness in her eyes, there was also a serenity Olivia hadn't seen before. "Hello, Margaret," Olivia said softly, approaching her. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret smiled faintly, but her voice was stronger than Olivia had expected. "I feel free, I think," Margaret replied, her gaze still lost in the landscape. "It's strange, Olivia. For so many years, I lived with guilt and doubt. I wondered if I had done something wrong, if I was somehow responsible for Charles' death, and now, knowing the truth..." She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Though it's painful, I also feel a kind of relief. It's as if a part of me has been trapped all this time, and now, finally, I can breathe." Olivia sat next to her, watching as Margaret processed her emotions. Though the truth had been devastating, Olivia knew Margaret had an inner strength that would help her overcome this chapter. "Charles would be proud of you, Margaret," Olivia said, her voice soft but firm. "You fought for him, for his memory, and you did the right thing. Now you can start to heal." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting Olivia's words comfort her. She knew the road to recovery wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer alone. Olivia, Alice, and George would support her every step of the way. "Thank you, Olivia," Margaret said, slowly opening her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You came into my life at a time when I needed you most, and though at first I didn't understand why you were here, now I know. You didn't just come to keep me company in my final days. You brought me hope." Olivia smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart that she hadn't experienced in a long time. All this time she had believed she was only helping Margaret, but the truth was that Margaret had also helped her. Olivia, who had arrived at the mansion broken and lost, had found purpose, a family, and a place to belong. "I'll always be here for you, Margaret," Olivia replied. "And you're not alone. Together we can get through this." As the two women shared a moment of peace, Alice entered the room, smiling as she saw them together. "George called earlier," Alice said. He wanted to let you know that the legal process against Victor is moving along smoothly. The authorities have found more evidence against him, and it seems everything is under control." Margaret nodded, though her face showed a slight sadness as she remembered the chaos Victor had caused. "It's a shame things had to end this way," Margaret murmured. "For years I thought Victor was someone I could trust. I never imagined he was capable of doing something so horrible." Alice approached Margaret and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't think about what you've lost," Alice said. "Think about what you've regained. You've dismantled the web of lies that held you captive, and now you can live in peace." Margaret looked at Alice, then at Olivia, nodding slowly. She knew Alice was right. Though she still felt the sting of betrayal, she also knew she had regained something invaluable: her freedom and the ability to move forward. "You're right, Alice," Margaret said, with a newfound determination in her voice. "There's still a lot to do, but at least now I can do it without the weight of Victor's lies." In the days that followed, Margaret began to recover little by little. With Olivia and Alice's help, she started to reorganize her life. She decided that instead of focusing on what she had lost, she would dedicate her energy to preserving her son's legacy and using the resources she had to help others. Olivia, for her part, also felt that a new chapter in her life was beginning. After years of living in uncertainty and pain, she had found a purpose and a family with Margaret and Alice. Together, they had overcome the hardest obstacles and were now ready to move forward toward a future full of hope. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Margaret took Olivia's hand and gently squeezed it. "Thank you for staying by my side," Margaret said with a sincere smile. "I don't know what the future holds for me, but I know that with people like you and Alice by my side, everything will be easier." Olivia smiled, returning the hand squeeze. "I will always be here, Margaret. This is our home, and together we can face whatever comes." And so, with the sun setting softly over the McAllister Mansion gardens, Margaret, Olivia and Alice gazed toward the horizon, knowing that although the road wouldn't always be easy, they were finally at peace and ready for whatever the future might bring. The weeks that followed Victor's arrest brought profound changes to the McAllister Mansion. The dark energy that had engulfed the house for so long began to dissipate, making room for something new. Despite the scars left by the betrayal, the elderly Margaret showed a strength that surprised everyone around her. Olivia and Alice were by her side every step of the way, helping her not only face the past, but also build a future that once seemed unreachable. One morning, as Olivia strolled through the garden, she paused to look at the mansion from the outside. That place, which had once seemed so distant and foreign, now felt like home. A home filled with memories and emotions, but also with possibilities. Olivia thought about how she had gotten here, a homeless young woman dragged by circumstances, now an essential part of a family that had fought to overcome the shadows of the past. Alice found her there, quietly observing. "Thinking about something important?" Alice asked with a smile. Olivia smiled back and nodded. "I was just reflecting on everything we've been through. This place, it feels so different now, like we can finally breathe in peace." Alice nodded, standing next to her. "It's been a long journey, but I think in some way everything we've gone through has made us stronger. Margaret has changed a lot, and so have you, Olivia. You've done more for this family than you could imagine." Olivia turned to Alice, surprised by her words. "I don't know if I did that much," Olivia said humbly. "I was just here when Margaret needed me." "That's what makes the difference," Alice replied, looking at her with appreciation. "Being there when you're most needed. That's the real test of strength." The morning sun bathed the garden in light, and the fresh air carried a sense of renewal. Alice and Olivia shared the moment in silence, enjoying the peace that finally embraced the McAllister Mansion. Later that day, Margaret asked them to join her in the parlor. She had something she wanted to share. The two women approached, finding Margaret sitting beside an old wooden box. Inside the box were documents and memories of her life, many of which had been stored away for years, untouched. "I've been thinking a lot," Margaret began, her voice soft but firm. "After everything we've been through, I feel it's time to make some changes, not just in my life, but in how I want my family's legacy to continue." Olivia and Alice exchanged curious glances, intrigued by what Margaret had to say. Olivia, when you first came here, I had no idea how much you would change my life, Margaret continued, looking at her lovingly. At first, I thought you'd just be with me during my last days, but now I see that's not the case. You've brought something into this house that I haven't felt in a long time, hope, and because of that, I want to do something important. Margaret pulled out a document from the box and handed it to Olivia. Confused, Olivia took it and began to read. In an instant, she realized what Margaret was doing. It was a modification to her will, naming Olivia as one of the primary heirs to her fortune and properties. Margaret, I can't accept this, Olivia said, shocked. I didn't come here for an inheritance. What we did was for you, not for money. Margaret smiled, placing her hand on Olivia's. I know, dear, and that's precisely why I want you to have this. It's not just about money or property. It's about ensuring that, when I'm no longer here, you'll have a home, a place where you belong. You've given me so much, and this is my way of thanking you for everything you've done. Olivia felt the tears welling up in her eyes. She had never imagined ending up in such a situation. For someone who had lost everything, finding a family and a home like this seemed impossible. I don't know what to say, Olivia murmured, deeply moved. This is more than I can accept. Just say you'll stay, Margaret replied with a tender smile. That you'll continue to be part of this family, because that's what we are now, a family. Alice, who had been silently observing, was also moved by Margaret's gesture. For years she had been the loyal nurse, but now she felt that the bond between the three of them had evolved into something much deeper. I'll always be here for you, Olivia said, her voice breaking with emotion. This is my home now, and I'll care for it the way you've cared for it all these years. Margaret nodded, satisfied with Olivia's response. That's all I needed to hear, Margaret replied warmly. This house will always be full of memories, but now it will also be full of a future, and you, Olivia, are part of that future. In the days that followed, Olivia, Margaret and Alice worked together to plan their way forward. Margaret decided that part of her fortune would go toward creating a foundation in Charles's honor, focused on helping young people who, like him, had faced emotional and financial struggles. Her son's legacy would be remembered not as a story of tragedy, but as a source of inspiration and help for others. Olivia became deeply involved in the foundation's plans, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that although her life had been marked by loss, she now had a mission that would allow her to give back to the world. Alice, for her part, took on the task of organizing the practical and legal details, making sure everything was in order. With each passing day, the McAllister mansion transformed more into a symbol of rebirth and hope. One afternoon, as the three women gathered in the garden, Olivia paused for a moment to observe them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm hues and wrapping everything in soft light. We've come so far, Olivia said quietly, more to herself than to the others. Margaret, who heard her, smiled. Yes, dear, and what's to come will be even better. As the sun disappeared over the horizon, the three women remained there, looking toward the future with the certainty that, despite all they had faced, together, they could build something beautiful. Days later, the atmosphere at the McAllister mansion was filled with an unusual calm. The chaos surrounding Victor's arrest and the discovery of his crimes seemed distant, though the aftermath of those events still lingered in every corner of the house. Margaret, Olivia and Alice continued with their lives, trying to rebuild what the turmoil had destroyed. But there was one final truth that had yet to come to light, a mystery buried in Olivia's past, one that was about to change everything. Olivia had been experiencing an unease she couldn't explain. Since Victor's arrest, something inside her told her that a key piece of the puzzle was still missing. She had gone through the McAllister family's accounts and financial records, but there was one connection she couldn't quite understand. Her own past was shrouded in shadows, and the deeper she delved into the family's secrets, the more she felt that her life and Margaret's were intertwined in ways she had never imagined. One afternoon, while going through Margaret's company documents again, Olivia found something that made her stop. It was an old file, dated years before Charles's death, related to a property the McAllister family had acquired. The name of that property was eerily familiar. It was the same address where the fire that destroyed Olivia's life had occurred and had taken her family. Olivia's heart raced. What was that property doing in the McAllister family's records? She felt that something was terribly wrong. She decided not to say anything to Margaret or Alice, at least not yet. First, she needed to know more. Over the next few days, Olivia dug deeper. She discovered that the property, the building where she had lived as a child, had been acquired by the McAllister Company as part of a real estate operation that aimed to demolish the old buildings to make way for a shopping mall. The plans, however, had been abruptly cancelled after the fire. The connections between her past and the McAllister family were clear now, but what she couldn't understand was how she had ended up working for Margaret without knowing anything about it. One night, unable to keep silent any longer, Olivia decided to confront Margaret. She needed answers. "Margaret, there's something I have to ask you," Olivia said, trying to stay calm as she entered the parlor where Margaret was resting. "It's about a property the McAllister Company acquired many years ago, a building that was part of my life before I lost everything." Margaret looked up, surprised by the grave tone in Olivia's voice. "What are you talking about, Olivia?" she asked, clearly confused. Olivia pulled out the file she had found and showed it to Margaret. "This building, it's where I lived with my family before the fire. The property was acquired by the McAllister Company. Why didn't you ever mention this to me?" Margaret took the file, examining the documents with a look of surprise. She clearly didn't recognize the details of the transaction. "I didn't know, Olivia," Margaret said, her voice tinged with concern. "The McAllister Company handled many acquisitions at that time. It was more focused on the family and Charles. I didn't know anything about this particular property." Olivia watched her carefully, looking for any sign that Margaret was hiding something, but the elderly woman seemed genuinely surprised. There were no lies in her eyes. Still, Olivia knew there was more to this story. "Margaret," Olivia said, her voice trembling slightly, "this fire destroyed my life. I lost my entire family. And now I find out that the property belonged to your company. This can't be a coincidence." Margaret's face darkened as she processed the information. The silence that followed was thick, filled with unanswered questions. Margaret, feeling responsible for what Olivia had gone through, even though she didn't truly know what had happened, sighed deeply. "I'm going to look into this," Margaret said with determination. "I don't know how it happened, but if the McAllister Company was involved in your tragedy, you deserve to know the truth." The next day, Margaret contacted George to help her review the company's oldest records, those dating back to the time of the fire. After hours of research, George found a long-forgotten report in the financial records. It mentioned irregularities in the operations related to Olivia's property, including reports of negligence in the building's maintenance and a demolition request that was never completed. The report also mentioned Victor. He was the one who had overseen those transactions, who had allowed the building's conditions to deteriorate to the point of turning it into a death trap. When Margaret read the report, her heart sank. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, trembling with rage and sadness. "Victor was responsible." Olivia, who had been anxiously waiting for the truth, felt the world collapse around her upon hearing those words. Everything she had believed, everything she had been through, was connected in the cruelest way possible. Victor, the same man who had destroyed the McAllister family, had also destroyed hers. "He knew," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "He knew who I was from the beginning, and yet he let me into this house. He used me, Margaret." Tears streamed down Olivia's face as Margaret hugged her tightly. They knew that Victor was already behind bars, but the anger they both felt for what he had done was not easily extinguished. "I'm so sorry, Olivia," Margaret said through sobs. "I didn't know any of this. If I had known, I would have done everything I could to stop it." Olivia gently pulled away, wiping her tears. Despite the pain she felt, she also knew that she now had something invaluable: the truth. She finally understood the destiny that had led her to the McAllister mansion. She had come here to face her worst enemy without even knowing it. But now, with Victor out of their lives, she had the chance to heal and rebuild. "Thank you, Margaret," Olivia said, taking a deep breath. "Thank you for helping me find the truth. Now I can move forward." The following days were full of reflection for both of them. Margaret, feeling responsible for Olivia's tragedy, did everything she could to show her that although the past couldn't be changed, the future still belonged to them. And Olivia, in time, began to accept that although the loss of her family would always be painful, she had found a new family in Margaret and Alice. The truth had come to light, and though it was bitter, Olivia knew it was what she needed to move on. The truth about the fire and Victor's connection to Olivia's tragedy had left an indelible mark on the lives of the three women. Margaret, Olivia, and Alice knew that although the dark chapter of Victor had finally come to an end, the emotional scars remained deep. Each of them faced the new reality in their own way as they tried to find a path toward inner peace. Days after the revelation, the McAllister mansion felt calmer, but there was a reflective air in every corner. Margaret spent much of her time in her room, recovering not only physically, but also emotionally from the weight she had carried for years. She had blamed herself for her son's death, but now, with the truth out in the open, she bore the burden of having, though unintentionally, been part of Olivia's tragedy. One afternoon, Olivia decided it was time to talk to Margaret. She knew they both needed to close this painful chapter together to move forward. She entered Margaret's room and found her gazing out the window, watching the gardens, which now seemed more peaceful but still laden with memories. "Margaret, may I sit with you?" Olivia asked gently. Margaret looked at her and nodded, offering a faint smile. "Of course, dear. Always." Olivia sat beside her, taking a moment to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot since we uncovered everything about Victor and my family, and I know this has been really hard on you. But I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened," she said softly with sincerity. "None of this was your fault. Victor acted behind your back just like he did with everyone." Margaret sighed, her eyes filled with guilt and pain. "I know, Olivia, but it's hard not to feel responsible. My company, my decisions could... If I had paid more attention, maybe things would have been different. Maybe you wouldn't have suffered so much." Olivia gently took Margaret's hand and squeezed it with affection. "Margaret, what happened is part of my story, but it doesn't define who I am today. Thanks to you, I've found a family. I've found purpose. I wouldn't trade that for anything in the world." Olivia's words seemed to lighten the burden Margaret had been carrying in her heart. For a long time, she had felt like everything she touched crumbled, but now she was beginning to realize that while the past couldn't be changed, the present and future were still full of hope. "You are an extraordinary woman, Olivia," Margaret said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never imagined someone like you would enter my life and change it so profoundly. You have no idea how much it means to me that you're still here by my side." Olivia smiled, wiping away a tear that slipped down her cheek. "I feel the same way about you, Margaret. You gave me something I thought I had lost forever, a home." During that conversation, both women began to leave behind the shared pain, choosing to focus on what they had built together. They knew the path to healing would be long, but they also knew they wouldn't be alone on that journey. In the following days, the McAllister mansion started to feel more like a home than a place filled with painful memories. Margaret, Olivia, and Alice worked together on small projects, reorganizing the house and planning for the future. With each passing day, the three women grew closer, sharing laughter, conversations, and quiet moments of peace. Though physically weaker, Margaret appeared more spirited. The foundation project in honor of Charles continued to make progress, and every time they spoke of it, her eyes shone with pride. Olivia and Alice knew this was the legacy Margaret wanted to leave behind, and they were committed to carrying out her vision. One afternoon, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset over the mansion's gardens, Margaret broke the silence. "I don't know how much longer I'll be here with you," Margaret said, her voice soft but steady. "But what I do know is that these past years have been the most important of my life. I've found something in you both that I thought was lost. You are my family. And I know no matter what happens, this house, this place will always be a home for us." Olivia and Alice exchanged warm smiles. They knew Margaret was at peace with what she had lived, and though the future was uncertain, they had found something far more valuable together: love, friendship, and unconditional support. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the garden was enveloped in the shadows of the night, the three women remained in quiet contemplation, savoring the calm that had finally settled over the McAllister mansion. The days grew quieter at the McAllister mansion. The soft autumn light filtered through the windows, casting a serene glow in the halls. Margaret had grown increasingly frail in recent weeks. Though her spirit remained strong, her body was beginning to yield to the toll of time and the hardships she had faced. Despite this, her mind was sharp, and she seemed at peace with herself and with what remained of her time. Olivia noticed the change. She saw how Margaret spent more time in silence, gazing at the gardens, the flowers, and the trees that had borne witness to so many stories. Though Margaret didn't say it, Olivia knew her time was drawing to a close. There was a peace in the air, but also a sense of farewell that Olivia couldn't ignore. One afternoon, Margaret asked Olivia to join her in the sitting room, where they usually had their long talks. The elderly woman, wrapped in a soft blanket over her shoulders, looked out the window as Olivia helped her settle into a chair by the fire. "Olivia, dear," Margaret began, her voice gentle but firm, "there's something we need to talk about. Something important." Olivia felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew this conversation would come eventually, but she wasn't prepared for what it would mean. "Of course, Margaret," she replied, sitting beside her. "I'm here for whatever you need." Margaret was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then she turned to Olivia, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "I've lived a long life," Margaret said calmly. "I've experienced more joy and sorrow than I can count, and though there were moments when I didn't think I could go on, now I'm at peace. I'm at peace because I know I've done everything within my power to right the wrongs of the past, and because, thanks to you, I've found a sense of purpose I thought was lost." Olivia listened in silence, feeling the weight of Margaret's words. She knew something significant was coming. "Olivia," Margaret continued, taking the young woman's hand, "from the moment you entered my life, you brought something I hadn't felt in years: hope. You didn't just give me company. You showed me that I could still make a difference, that my life still had meaning, even in my final days. And for that, I want you to know that everything I have, my entire fortune, this house, my properties, it all belongs to you now." Olivia was stunned, her eyes welling up with tears. "Margaret, note, I can't accept this. I didn't come here to inherit anything. I came to be with you, to help you, and to—" Margaret gently squeezed Olivia's hand, interrupting her. "I know, dear, but that's exactly why I'm giving it to you. You're not doing this out of self-interest, and you never have. That's why I know you're the right person to carry on what I've built. This house, these assets, they're yours. And I trust you'll know what to do with them. But more importantly, Olivia, I want you to always remember one thing. This place now is your home. Not just a property, but a refuge. A place where you will always be welcome, where you will always find peace." Tears began to stream down Olivia's face, and though she tried to speak, the words caught in her throat. "I don't know what to say, Margaret," she finally whispered. "You've been like a mother to me. I can't imagine my life without you." Margaret smiled, a warm and tender smile, as her eyes glistened with emotion. "You've given me so much, Olivia. You brought me back to life in my final years, and now it's your turn to live fully. Don't think of this as a goodbye. Think of it as a new chapter, one you will have the opportunity to write with everything I've left for you. I've lived my life, and now it's time for you to live yours, without fear, with freedom and love." Unable to hold back, Olivia embraced Margaret tightly, feeling the frailty of her body, but also the immense love that bound them. She knew this moment would be one she would remember forever. "Thank you, Margaret," she murmured through her tears. "Thank you for everything you've given me. I promise I will take care of this home, of your legacy. I will do everything I can to make you proud." Margaret gently stroked Olivia's hair with affection. "I'm already proud of you, dear. I always will be." The two women remained in silence for a while longer, embracing as the afternoon faded into night and the shadows in the room grew longer. Later that night, Margaret retired to her bedroom, accompanied by Olivia and Alice, who helped her into bed. The elderly woman was more at peace than she had been in a long time. Her last words to Olivia were filled with love and gratitude. "Rest now, my dear," Margaret whispered as she closed her eyes. tomorrow belongs to you. And that night, in the quiet of her room, Margaret McAllister said her final goodbye to the world, leaving behind a legacy of love, redemption, and hope. Olivia, sitting by her bedside, held her hand for the last time, feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She knew Margaret had left in peace, having made amends with her past and trusting in Olivia's future. The next morning, as the sun began to light up the gardens, Olivia stepped out onto the porch, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. The mansion, now hers, felt different, but not empty. There was an echo of Margaret in every corner, in every flower, in every part of the house. Standing under the morning sun, Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, feeling Margaret's presence still with her. She knew she had a responsibility now, not just with the assets that had been entrusted to her, but with the legacy Margaret had left behind. And though the pain of loss was deep, Olivia also knew that Margaret had given her the greatest gift, a home, a family, and the opportunity to move forward, building something new from the ashes of the past. Olivia stood before the large window in the living room, watching as the first rays of the sun bathed the garden in a soft light. The morning air was cool, and there was a deep silence in the McAllister mansion. Since Margaret's passing, everything seemed to have paused for a moment, as if time were giving her a breather to process what had happened. Only a day had passed since Margaret had gone, but for Olivia, it felt as if an entire life had changed in an instant. Holding a cup of tea in her hands, her mind wandered in silence, leading her to an internal dialogue that was inevitable after Margaret's farewell. "She's gone," Olivia thought as her gaze drifted to the horizon. "The woman who saved me when I didn't even know how to save myself. And now, here I am, with everything she's left me, her legacy, her assets, her story. But beyond all that, she's given me something far more valuable: faith in myself." The wind stirred the branches of the trees, and Olivia felt a deep connection to everything around her. She had arrived at that house with nothing but her pain and despair. A young woman lost in a world that had treated her harshly, marked by the tragedy of her past. But Margaret had seen something in her that even Olivia hadn't seen: her ability to move forward, to find strength in the chaos. "Who am I now?" she wondered silently. "I'm no longer the broken young woman wandering aimlessly through the streets. Margaret taught me to believe in the future, to believe in myself. She showed me that pain doesn't have to define who I am." The weight of the responsibility now resting on her shoulders was immense. She held in her hands Margaret's foundation, her legacy, her home. But oddly enough, she didn't feel afraid. Instead, there was a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. "I've spent much of my life believing that what happened to me in the past would determine my destiny," Olivia thought, as her fingers softly traced the edge of the cup. "But Margaret showed me that's not true. She gave me the chance to write my own story, to be more than just a victim of circumstances. She gave me her trust, and that's more powerful than any fortune or property." The pain of losing Margaret was still palpable, but within that sadness, Olivia found an unexpected source of strength. She remembered Margaret's last words, telling her that tomorrow belonged to her, that she had the freedom to build her own life. And now, for the first time, Olivia felt those words were true. She was no longer adrift. "I've spent so long feeling like I didn't belong anywhere," she reflected, as her eyes settled on the flowers Margaret had loved so much. "But now I know that Margaret gave me more than just a home. She gave me the ability to create my own place in the world. This is my home, my life, and I have the power to decide what to do with it." Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a warm breeze brush her skin. She took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel everything that was passing through her heart. She knew there would be hard days ahead, days when she would miss Margaret, when she would feel overwhelmed by the responsibility. But she also knew those days would be part of her growth, of her transformation into the woman Margaret had seen in her from the beginning. "I'm not the same Olivia I was when I arrived here," she thought with determination. "Now I'm someone who can face pain, overcome challenges, and live a life full of purpose." With a sense of clarity she had never experienced before, Olivia realized that Margaret hadn't just left her material possessions. She had given her the most valuable gift of all, the power to believe in herself and the freedom to build her own destiny. "Thank you, Margaret," she murmured in her mind, a soft smile forming on her lips, "for giving me a second chance, for showing me there's always a way forward. I promise I'll take care of your legacy, but I'll also take care of myself. I'll keep moving forward, not just for you, but for me." Olivia set the cup aside and walked toward the garden door. As she strolled among the flowers, she felt that each step was bringing her closer to her own future, a future that, though uncertain, was full of possibilities. Margaret was no longer physically there, but her presence, her love, and her wisdom would continue to guide Olivia in every decision she made, in every step she took. "Tomorrow belongs to me," she thought with conviction, "and I will live it fully, with everything I am." And that concludes this emotional story. If it touched your heart as much as it did ours, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe, and share this video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation and legacy. See you in the next story.